All right, today we're diving deep into something pretty fascinating and maybe even a little intimidating.
Yeah.
It's the Bhartiya Nyay Sanhita, the 2023 version to be exact, and we're zeroing in on how it tackles offenses against public tranquility.
You got it.
You're interested in understanding this complex topic, and quickly but thoroughly. And that's exactly what we're here to do.
That's right. We're breaking down this BNS 2023, which is a legal document, by the way, in a way that'll make sense, without getting too bogged down in all that legal jargon.
Right.
No personal opinions here.
Okay.
Just the facts, straight from the document.
Perfect. So let's jump right in. When we say public tranquility in the context of the BNS, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about the peace and order of society. You can think of it as like the thing that allows people to just go about their daily lives, without fear of anything or anyone disrupting them. It's what keeps society running smoothly.
So would it be safe to say that offenses against public tranquility are basically actions that disrupt that peace and order?
Exactly. And the BNS tackles a bunch of these, but one of the key concepts is something called the unlawful assembly. This is where things start to get interesting.
Okay, unlawful assembly. So what exactly makes an assembly unlawful, according to the BNS?
Well, Section 189 lays out 5 very specific conditions that, if met, classify a gathering of 5 or more people as an unlawful assembly.
5 conditions, all right? I am all ears.
So the first one is if the common object of this assembly is to overawe the government by using criminal force.
Okay.
And that could be the central government, a state government, parliament, or even just a public servant doing their job.
Gotcha. So if a group of people gets together and their goal is to use force or even the threat of force to basically intimidate the government, that's condition number 1.
You got it.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second condition?
The second condition is resisting the execution of any law or any legal process.
Okay.
Like imagine a group that's actively preventing law enforcement from carrying out a lawful warrant, that kind of scenario.
Okay, so resisting the law itself.
So
what's the third condition then?
The third one is committing mischief or criminal trespass or any other offense. So this one's a bit broader, covering a range of actions that disrupt public order.
Okay, so if we see a gathering that's using force to damage property, that could fall under this condition.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Okay.
Or if they're forcefully occupying someone else's land without permission, that would also fall under this condition.
Right, okay. So we've got overawing the government, resisting the law, and committing other offenses.
Right.
What are those last 2 conditions?
Okay, so the fourth one is using force or the threat of force to take possession of property.
Okay.
Or depriving someone of the enjoyment of a right-of-way or a right to use water or any other incorporeal right.
Okay. That sounds a little more complex. Can you break it down a bit?
Sure.
What would that look like in a real-world situation?
Okay, so picture this. A group of people blocking access to a public road, preventing cars and people from getting through. Or maybe they cut off the water supply to a whole community, forcefully. These would be examples of using force to deprive people of their rights.
Right, I see. So it's about disrupting access to essential things like roads, water, or even, like you said, their right to peace and quiet. What about that 5th and final condition?
Okay, so the 5th condition is compelling, by force or threat of force, any person to do what he is not legally bound to do or to omit to do what he is legally entitled to do.
Okay, so it's essentially coercion, right?
Yeah.
Forcing someone to do something they don't have to legally or preventing them from exercising their legal rights.
You got it.
This all sounds pretty serious.
It is.
So let's say someone finds themselves in an assembly that meets one or more of these conditions. What happens then?
Well, that's where Section 189 too comes in. It basically says that simply being aware that the assembly is unlawful and you still choose to stay makes you a member.
Wait, so even if you're not the one blocking the road or cutting off the water, just being there, knowing it's an unlawful assembly, can get you in trouble?
That's right. And the BNS 2023 is very specific about the punishments for being part of an unlawful assembly.
Okay, let's talk about those punishments. What are we looking at here?
Well, just for being a member of an unlawful assembly, you could face imprisonment for up to 6 months, a fine, or both.
6 months. Just for being there.
It might seem a little harsh, but the law is meant to deter people from participating in these unlawful assemblies in the first place.
Right.
The idea is that if people know there are real consequences, even for just being present, they'll be less likely to join.
So it's about sending a clear message, basically saying, don't even think about joining because there are consequences, even if you're not the one causing trouble.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining that peace and stability. Now things get even more serious when an unlawful assembly turns into a riot.
This is where things get really interesting, I think. Tell me more about this transition from unlawful assembly to riot.
Okay, Section 191 is key here. The defining factor is the use of force or violence by an unlawful assembly. When that line is crossed, it becomes a riot.
So an unlawful assembly is more about the potential for disruption, while a riot is the actual act of violence.
Yes.
Like if they start throwing rocks, damaging property, or hurting people, then it becomes a riot.
Exactly. And the penalties reflect that escalation. Participating in a riot could land you in prison for up to 2 years, a fine, or both.
Okay.
And if you're carrying a deadly weapon during the riot, 5 years imprisonment, a fine, or both.
So there's a pattern here. The BNS draws a clear line between the potential for disruption and the actual act of violence, with harsher consequences for the latter.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the increased severity of the offense
Right.
and deterring people from engaging in that violence. But it's not just about those directly participating in the violence. The BNS also looks at those who incite the violence and those who have a responsibility to prevent it.
Okay, this is fascinating. Let's talk about those who provoke these situations.
All right, Section 192 deals with provoking a riot. It says that if you intentionally provoke someone, knowing it could lead to a riot, you could be imprisoned for up to 1 year, fined, or both if a riot actually occurs.
Okay.
And even if a riot doesn't happen, you can still be imprisoned for up to 6 months, fined, or both.
So even the attempt to incite violence is punishable.
Hmm.
What about the responsibility to prevent it, though?
Right.
Who does the BNS place that burden on?
Interestingly, Section 193 specifically addresses the responsibility of landowners.
Okay.
It says that if an unlawful assembly or riot takes place on their property and they knew or had reason to believe it was likely, they can be fined.
So if, let's say, a protest on someone's private property escalates into a riot, the landowner could be held accountable, even if they didn't organize the protest or take part in the violence.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
The law expects them to take steps to prevent these events.
That's a significant responsibility.
Yeah.
It seems like the BNS is saying that maintaining public order is a shared responsibility. It's not just the role of law enforcement, but citizens have a part to play as well.
Absolutely. And that shared responsibility is a key theme throughout the BNS.
Okay, so we've covered unlawful assembly, rioting, incitement, and the role of landowners.
Mm-hmm.
What other offenses against public tranquility does the BNS address?
Well, there's something called affray, which is basically fighting in public that disturbs the peace.
Like a brawl breaking out in a crowded marketplace.
Exactly. Section 194 defines affray as a fight that takes place in a public place
Okay.
and is likely to cause terror to the public.
Gotcha. So what happens if someone is trying to break up an affray, or a riot for that matter, and someone else tries to stop them?
That's where Section 195 comes in. It focuses on assaulting or obstructing public servants who are just trying to do their jobs,
Oh,
trying to disperse an unlawful assembly, suppress a riot, or prevent an affray.
and I imagine the penalties for that are pretty serious.
Oh, absolutely. You're looking at imprisonment for up to 3 years, a fine, or both. Plus, there's a minimum fine of 25,000 rupees.
25,000 rupees. That's a pretty hefty fine. Why such a strong stance?
It highlights how important it is to protect those who are upholding the law and trying to keep things peaceful. Obstructing them is dangerous.
Yeah.
Not only for the officers themselves, but it also makes it much harder to do their job, which ultimately makes the situation worse.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect. Interfering with those who are trying to restore order just creates more chaos.
Precisely. And the BNS doesn't stop there. It also tackles offenses that can directly incite unrest and division within society.
Such as?
Sections 196 and 197 deal with promoting disharmony and spreading false information, particularly when it's based on things like religion, race, language, region, caste, community, or any other ground.
So actions that could lead to conflict between different groups.
Exactly. And the BNS recognizes that these offenses can be even more damaging in certain contexts.
What do you mean?
The penalties for promoting disharmony or spreading false information are much more severe if these things happen in places of worship or religious assemblies.
Oh, I see. So places where people are gathered for religious purposes,
Okay.
which makes them potentially more susceptible to incitement and division.
Precisely. It recognizes the sensitive nature of these spaces and the increased risk of disrupting public tranquility when these offenses happen there.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. It seems like the BNS really covers a lot of ground when it comes to offenses against public tranquility.
It does. It's a comprehensive framework for understanding how the law looks at actions that disrupt peace and order.
All right, so before we move on, let's do a quick recap for our listener. We've covered the definition of unlawful assembly and rioting, the escalating punishments, the responsibilities of landowners, and the severe penalties for obstructing public servants and promoting disharmony.
A lot to cover, but it's a good start to understanding how the BNS approaches these offenses against public tranquility.
Definitely. But here are the thought-provoking questions for you to consider. How do these laws in the BNS 2023 reflect a balance between individual freedoms and the need for public order? It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And one that's worth thinking about.
Very important question. We'll be diving into specific sections and exploring those nuances a bit more in the next part of your deep dive. But for now, think about this. How do these laws try to strike a balance between protecting individual rights and maintaining a peaceful society?
We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive into the BNS 2023. Stay tuned.
So, ready to dive back into the BNS and see what else we can uncover about offenses against public tranquility?
Absolutely. We laid a good foundation, but I'm really curious to unpack some of these specific sections in a little more detail now. Where should we start?
Well, we could revisit Section 189, the one that defines an unlawful assembly. Remember those 5 conditions?
Yeah.
I think it'd be helpful to look at some real-world scenarios, just to illustrate how those conditions might actually play out.
Yeah, I agree. Concrete examples always help make things a bit clearer. Let's take condition D, the one about using force to take property or disrupt someone's right-of-way. What would that look like in a real situation?
Okay, well, imagine a group of people. They decide to block the entrance to a hospital,
Okay.
preventing ambulances from getting in or out.
Yeah.
That would be a very clear example of disrupting a right-of-way, and it could have serious consequences for people needing medical care.
Right.
Or think about a situation where a group forcefully cuts off access to a public park,
Yeah.
denying everyone else the right to enjoy that space.
Yeah, those are really powerful examples. It's easy to see how those actions would disrupt public order and impact people's lives.
Yeah.
It goes beyond just an inconvenience. It's infringing on basic rights.
Exactly. And that's precisely why the BNS takes such a strong stance against these unlawful assemblies.
Okay.
It recognizes the potential for those gatherings to escalate into situations that threaten public safety and well-being.
Now, we talked about the penalties for being a member of an unlawful assembly.
Right.
But you mentioned that just being aware of the assembly being unlawful is enough to be considered a member.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Section 189, too, clarifies that simply being aware of the facts that make an assembly unlawful and still choosing to participate or stay there makes you a member.
Okay.
Let's say you're walking down the street
Okay.
and you come across a large gathering. You see them putting up barricades, maybe chanting slogans about using force to disrupt a government function.
Okay.
Even if you don't join in or actively do anything.
Right.
If you stay there knowing the situation is escalating towards an unlawful assembly, you could be held accountable.
So it's not enough to just not participate in those unlawful actions.
Right.
You have a responsibility to actually remove yourself from the situation entirely if you know it's becoming unlawful.
Precisely. The law is emphasizing that just being a passive bystander in an unlawful assembly, it's not a neutral stance.
Okay.
Your presence adds to the overall potential for disruption and disorder.
That's an important distinction.
No.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that transition from an unlawful assembly to a riot. Section 191 is key here, right?
Yes, it is. And as we touched on before, the main difference boils down to the use of force or violence.
Yeah.
An unlawful assembly, it might have that potential to disrupt the peace.
Right.
But a riot actually crosses that line and becomes an act of actual violence. Think of it this way. An unlawful assembly is like a gathering storm.
Okay.
It has the potential to unleash chaos, but a riot is the storm actually hitting with all its destructive force.
So if that gathering we talked about earlier starts throwing rocks, damaging property, or hurting people, that's when it becomes a riot.
Exactly. That escalation from potential threat to actual violence, that's what defines a riot. And as we discussed, the penalties reflect that increased severity.
Right. We see that jump from a maximum of 2 years imprisonment for being part of an unlawful assembly to a potential 5 years if you're armed during a riot. It's a pretty big increase in punishment.
Absolutely. The BNS draws a very clear distinction between those who just participate in an unlawful assembly
Right.
and those who actually engage in the violence of a riot.
Okay.
Those heavier penalties for rioting, they serve as a strong deterrent and underscore how serious those actions are.
Now, what about the people who may not be directly participating in the violence, but they're encouraging it?
Right. That's where Section 192 comes into play. It addresses the idea of provocation,
Okay.
which, as we mentioned before, carries its own set of penalties,
Right.
even if a riot doesn't actually happen.
Right. We talked about how inciting violence can land you in prison even if the riot doesn't occur.
Yeah.
But what does the BNS consider to be provocation? Is it just yelling, fight, fight, fight in a crowd?
It's a little more nuanced than that. Yeah. The BNS defines provocation as intentionally doing something illegal with the intent to cause a riot, or knowing that your actions are likely to lead to a riot. So, for example, spreading inflammatory rumors about a particular group with the intention of stirring up anger and violence, that could be considered provocation.
So it's not just angry words or a heated argument. It's deliberate actions that are illegal and intended to incite violence.
Precisely. The BNS recognizes that provocation can take many forms, and it aims to hold those who intentionally incite violence accountable, regardless of whether their actions directly result in a riot or not.
Now, we discussed the responsibility of landowners when it comes to unlawful assemblies and riots happening on their property.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about what they're actually expected to do. What are their specific obligations under the BNS?
Section 193 goes into detail about that. It says that if a landowner knows or has reason to believe that an unlawful assembly or riot is happening or is likely to happen on their land, they have to take specific actions.
Okay, so they can't just turn a blind eye and pretend it's not happening. What are they actually required to do?
Well, first and foremost, they have to report it to the nearest police station as soon as possible.
Okay.
Second, if they believe it's about to happen, they need to use all lawful means to prevent it.
Okay.
This could include things like hiring security, putting up barriers, or even just talking to the people involved and trying to de-escalate the situation.
Right.
And lastly, if it does happen, they have to do everything they can to disperse or suppress the riot or unlawful assembly.
So it's not just about calling the police. They're expected to actively try and prevent the situation from escalating.
Yeah.
But what if the landowner isn't even there when the unlawful assembly starts?
That's where the reason to believe part comes in.
Okay.
Even if the landowner isn't physically present, if they had reason to believe that an unlawful assembly was likely, they could still be held accountable.
Okay.
So, for instance, if there were widespread rumors about a planned protest that could turn violent, and the landowner did nothing to prepare or take preventative measures, they could be considered negligent.
That makes sense. It's about taking reasonable steps to try and prevent these situations from escalating. It sounds like a pretty big responsibility, especially in situations that could get out of hand quickly.
It is, absolutely. The BNS puts a significant burden on landowners to maintain peace and order on their property. It's a recognition that they have a role to play in preventing these unlawful assemblies and riots from occurring.
This whole conversation about unlawful assemblies and riots has been really fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about what the BNS says about other actions that can disrupt public tranquility.
Yeah.
What else is considered an offense?
Well, we've talked about the more serious offenses like rioting and inciting violence. But the BNS also addresses actions that might seem, less extreme,
Right.
but still have the potential to disrupt peace and order. For example, there's the concept of affray, which is basically a public fight that disturbs the peace.
Okay, so like a brawl breaking out in a crowded marketplace and it starts to cause panic and fear, that would be considered an affray.
Exactly. Section 194 defines affray as a fight that takes place in a public place and is likely to cause terror to the public.
Okay.
It carries a punishment of imprisonment for up to 1 month, a fine of up to 1,000 rupees, or both.
Okay.
But the BNS also specifically addresses interfering with those who are trying to restore order in these situations.
You mean like interfering with the police or other officials trying to break up an affray or a riot?
Exactly. Imagine a situation where a police officer is trying to arrest someone who's participating in a riot and someone else tries to physically stop the officer or even attacks them.
And I'm guessing the penalties for that are pretty serious.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about imprisonment of up to 3 years.
Okay.
And a minimum fine of 25,000 rupees.
Wow, a minimum fine of 25,000 rupees?
Yeah.
That's a hefty penalty. Why such a strong stance?
Well, it underscores how crucial it is to protect those who are upholding the law and trying to maintain that public order. Obstructing them not only disrupts their work, it also undermines the peace and stability we're talking about. Think of it this way. When someone interferes with a police officer who's trying to restore order, they're not just harming that individual officer.
Right.
They're harming the entire system that's designed to protect society.
Yeah, it's a chain reaction. Interfering with those trying to restore order just makes the situation worse and puts everyone at risk. It's fascinating how the BNS lays out these escalating consequences, creating this framework for maintaining peace in so many different scenarios.
It really does, and it doesn't stop there. The BNS also addresses actions that can directly incite unrest and division within society, even without any physical violence.
You're talking about sections 196 and 197, which deal with promoting disharmony and spreading false information.
Yes. These sections target actions that can incite hatred, division, and unrest, particularly when they exploit sensitive issues like religion, race, or regional differences. Sometimes words can be just as dangerous as weapons. Spreading false information or hate speech can really damage social harmony and lead to some serious, real-world consequences.
Right. We talked about how these offenses can lead to conflict and instability, but I'm curious about the specific types of actions that fall under these sections. What kind of things would actually violate these parts of the BNS?
Well, Section 196 covers a pretty broad range of actions, including promoting or attempting to promote disharmony
Okay.
or feelings of enmity, hatred, or ill will between different religious, racial, language, or regional groups. It also includes doing anything that's prejudicial to the maintenance of harmony between these groups,
Okay.
or that disturbs, or is likely to disturb, public tranquility.
So it's not just outright hate speech. It also includes actions that might seem less overtly hateful, but still contribute to creating division and unrest.
Exactly. The BNS takes a comprehensive approach, recognizing that promoting disharmony can take many forms, some subtle, some more blatant.
And what about Section 197? What does it target?
Section 197 focuses on spreading false information that jeopardizes national security, sovereignty, unity, and integrity. It also addresses actions that make or publish imputations concerning any class of persons in the country, denying them their rights as citizens or inciting hatred, contempt, or disaffection towards them based on their religion, race, language, or regional group.
So it's about targeting actions that spread lies and misinformation, basically, that can harm national security and sow discord among different groups within the country.
Precisely. The BNS recognizes that false information and divisive rhetoric can be incredibly damaging to public tranquility and national unity.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the penalties for these offenses are harsher if they're committed in places of worship or religious assemblies. Why is that distinction made?
It comes down to recognizing just how sensitive these spaces are. Places of worship are meant to be havens of peace and spiritual reflection. When these spaces are used to promote disharmony or spread false information, it violates their sanctity, but it also has the potential to inflame tensions and incite violence much more easily.
Right, because places of worship hold a special significance for people.
Exactly.
And using those spaces to spread hate or misinformation is like adding fuel to the fire, right?
Yeah.
It amplifies the potential for harm and disruption.
Exactly. The BNS recognizes that heightened risk of disrupting public tranquility when these offenses happen in these sensitive contexts, and that's why it assigns heavier punishments.
This has been incredibly insightful. You've done a great job breaking down these complex concepts and explaining them in a way that's easy to understand. It's really eye-opening to see how the BNS approaches these offenses against public tranquility.
I'm glad you're finding it insightful. It's a fascinating area of law, and understanding it is crucial for navigating the complexities of public life.
We'll be wrapping up this deep dive in the next part. Yeah. But before we move on, are there any other key points you want to highlight?
I think it's worth reiterating that the BNS provides a very comprehensive framework for maintaining public tranquility.
Okay.
It not only defines the offenses, but it also establishes very clear penalties
Right.
and outlines the responsibilities of individuals and authorities in preventing and responding to these situations. It's designed to protect the peace and order of society at multiple levels.
That's a really great point. It's not just about punishing wrongdoers. It's about creating a system that proactively prevents disruptions and maintains a stable and peaceful environment for everyone.
Exactly. And that multifaceted approach is what we'll be delving into further in the final part of our deep dive.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, we're back for the final part of your deep dive into the BNS 2023 and its approach to offenses against public tranquility. It's been a pretty interesting journey, exploring the whole idea of how to keep the peace and maintain order in society.
It has been. We've covered a lot of ground, from defining those unlawful assemblies and riots to understanding what landowners are responsible for and the consequences of getting in the way of public servants doing their jobs.
Right. And we can't forget those sections about stirring up trouble and spreading false information, especially in sensitive places like places of worship. It's been really eye-opening to see how the BNS 2023 handles all these issues.
Absolutely. And as we wrap things up here, it's really important to remember that the BNS 2023 isn't just a set of, rules and punishments.
Right.
It's more of a framework designed to find a balance between individual freedoms and the need for public order. It's about creating a society where people can exercise their rights without fear of violence or disruption.
That's a great point. It's not about stifling dissent or limiting free speech. It's about preventing things from escalating into violence and disrupting the peace.
Exactly.
Setting those boundaries, that protect individual rights and the good of everyone.
You got it. Think of it like this. You have the freedom to say what you think, but you don't have the freedom to yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
That's because your actions, even your words, can have real consequences for other people. The BNS 2023 gets this, and it aims to stop harm from happening while still protecting those fundamental freedoms.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you want to leave our listener with?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing to remember is that the BNS 2023 draws a very clear line between an unlawful assembly and a riot.
Okay.
It defines them very specifically, and the penalties are different too, reflecting how serious each offense is. An unlawful assembly might cause trouble, but it only becomes a riot when there's actual force or violence involved. It's a really important difference to understand.
Right, like the gathering storm analogy you used. An unlawful assembly is the storm brewing, but a riot is when the storm actually hits with full force.
Exactly. And the BNS 2023 recognizes that difference, assigning punishments accordingly.
Okay, what else?
Well, another key point is that the BNS 2023 really stresses shared responsibility. It doesn't just put all the pressure on law enforcement. It expects people, especially landowners, to be proactive in preventing these situations from getting out of hand. Maintaining peace and order is a job for everyone.
Yeah, like that old saying, it takes a village.
Right.
It seems like the BNS 2023 is saying it takes a whole society working together to keep things peaceful.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's important to understand just how seriously the BNS 2023 takes actions that target public servants or that incite disharmony and spread false information.
Right.
These things can really damage a peaceful and stable society.
It's a reminder that words and actions have power.
Yeah.
And the BNS 2023 wants to make sure people are accountable for what they say and do, Freedom of expression goes hand in hand with responsibility.
Well said. The BNS 2023 helps us navigate that tricky balance between individual freedoms and keeping the peace.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. I feel like we've got a much better grasp on how the BNS 2023 deals with these offenses against public tranquility.
I agree. And even though we covered a lot, there's always more to explore.
Right.
It's a complex document, that's for sure, but it's also really fascinating. You can learn a lot about the values and priorities of a society that's working towards peace and order.
And hopefully this deep dive has made you curious enough to explore this topic even more. It's not just about laws, it's about understanding the principles behind a peaceful and just society, right?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that peace and order don't just happen. They take continuous effort, thoughtful engagement, and a real commitment to the values that make a society strong and resilient.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So we're going to wrap up this deep dive here, but remember, your own exploration doesn't have to end. The BNS 2023 is a public document. There's a ton of information just waiting to be uncovered.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep striving for a deeper understanding of everything around you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.